A man is falling toward a planet no human being has ever touched. He knows he will not survive the landing, and somehow, in his final minutes, he is smiling. That's where Star City leaves us at the close of Season 1, a finale that refuses to hand out a single clean, happy ending and is all the better for it. Before we get there, though, we need to talk about how a spacecraft that was supposed to be a smoking wreck turned out to be very much alive, and how that one twist set off a chain of betrayals, sacrifices, and impossible choices that define everything this show has been building toward. I make these breakdowns all by myself, digging deep into every detail so you don't have to. And if you're enjoying these Star City deep dives, make sure to subscribe, unless you want Chief Designer knocking on your door for questioning. I'm kidding, mostly. Before we dive into the biggest possibilities, let's start with the core idea. There are really only a few ways to explain what Star City is setting up, and each one could completely change how we see the story. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Valya chose to die alone on Venus, why his best friend nearly killed him with his bare hands hours earlier, how a Soviet chief engineer used a decoy of himself to survive torture, and why the story's most quietly heroic character might be a woman who spends almost the entire episode alone in orbit. We'll also dig into what's being set up for a second season, and which of these character arcs feel the most fragile heading into it. Let's start where the finale starts, with 3 people who should be dead. The fire that didn't kill them. Everyone watching, characters included, assumed the Venera capsule had been lost. Instead, we learn that the blaze aboard the ship only consumed part of it, and that cutting the power during the emergency actually helped snuff out the flames by dropping the cabin pressure. That's the good news. The bad news is brutal. The onboard computer that handled navigation and communication was destroyed in the process, meaning Sasha, Lakshmi, and Valya were now flying blind, completely cut off from Star City and drifting off their intended path toward Venus. This is the moment the episode's title, The Wolves, starts to make sense. Cut off from any outside help, stripped of the systems that were supposed to keep them safe, the 3 cosmonauts are suddenly exposed in every sense, politically, physically, emotionally. And it's here that the show delivers one of its rawest character beats. Sasha attacking Valya, hands around his throat, ready to choke the life out of him. It's worth sitting with why this happens, because it isn't really about the fire. Sasha isn't just angry that the ship is damaged. He's processing all at once the fact that his closest friend has been secretly working with the Americans, that this betrayal likely triggered the disaster in the first place, and that the 3 of them are now stranded with no way to call for help. Valya tries to explain that everything he did to protect Tanya, the woman he loves. To Sasha, in that moment, it isn't remotely enough. It's Lakshmi who talks him down, pleading with him until the rage finally breaks and he lets go. But something has shifted between the 3 of them that can't be undone, which raises a question worth holding on to as the episode unfolds. Is Valya's later sacrifice really redemption, or is it simply the only option left to a man who has run out of anywhere else to go? A one-way trip to Venus, with no propellant left to correct their course, the crew is on track to miss Venus entirely, and without that planet's gravity to sling them back toward Earth, they're doomed. Valya's solution is as elegant as it is devastating. Manually pilot the small landing probe, the bathysphere, using its own thrust to nudge the main ship back onto the correct trajectory. The catch is that once that probe separates and fires its engine, there's no bringing it back. Whoever climbs inside is going to Venus, permanently. Valya volunteers, and by this point in the story, it's hard to see it purely as heroism. It's also survival math. He knows that returning to Earth means one of 2 things: an immediate execution as a traitor to the state, or a life spent in hiding, always waiting for a Soviet agent to find him. Venus, strangely, is the only place left where nobody can touch him. There's something quietly poetic in the final image the show gives him, floating toward a planet that will kill him within minutes of landing, and choosing to feel, if only briefly, a kind of peace instead of fear. He confirms with Sasha that the trajectory correction worked before severing the connection and beginning his descent. He becomes technically the first human being to reach the surface of another planet. And almost nobody back on Earth will ever be allowed to know it. The chief designers gamble back on the ground. The story shifts into something closer to a spy thriller. When Sergei Nikolov learns that Venera is intact and likely carries survivors, He brings the news to the disgraced chief designer, now living under close watch after his fall from favor. For a man who has spent the last stretch of the season sidelined and humiliated, this is the first real spark of purpose he's had, a chance to save the very cosmonauts whose mission he engineered. The problem is obvious. If Sasha, Lakshmi, and Valya land where they're expected to, in Kazakhstan they'll be treated as an embarrassment the state never sanctioned, and dealt with accordingly. So the chief designer works out an alternate solution. By steepening the capsule's re-entry angle, they can use atmospheric drag itself to alter the landing site. No propellant required, redirecting the ship away from Soviet territory entirely. But knowledge without a way to deliver it is worthless. That's where the plan becomes genuinely risky, pulling in people who have every reason to say no. Building a chain of trust, Nikolov turns to Stepanov, an engineer with access to the right console, and initially gets pushback. Not out of cowardice exactly, but out of disbelief and fear. Helping reroute a disavowed spacecraft is treason, full stop. What seems to tip Stepanov toward yes isn't a grand political argument. It's smaller and more human than that. The idea that his old mentor, the chief designer, personally remembered him and needed his help. That kind of professional loyalty, the desire to matter to someone you admire, ends up being strong enough to override the fear of prison, or worse. The plan itself is clever, precisely because it exploits a gap in Soviet surveillance. Direct transmissions to the capsule would be intercepted immediately, but there are brief windows during SALYUT-1's orbit when it loses contact with ground control entirely. During those windows, Anastasia, Sasha's wife, herself a cosmonaut aboard Salyut, can relay the coded instructions without anyone on Earth listening in. The chief designer's wife hands off the final calculations to Nikolov in a crowded market, a small, tense scene that underlines just how much danger everyone involved has accepted. When the message reaches Lakshmi, she's the one who recognizes it isn't garbled data but a coded set of coordinates, redirecting them to land in Finland instead. And in a quieter, aching moment, Anastasia manages to reach Sasha directly. He asks whether he'll ever see her again once he's outside the Iron Curtain. She doesn't really have an answer. Leaving the Soviet Union isn't something available to her, but she pushes him to follow the plan anyway, because his survival matters more to her than her own chance at happiness. It should have worked. It very nearly did. Irina chooses herself. If there's a single character whose choices define the emotional cost of this finale, it's Irina. She spent the season positioned as Lyudmilla's protege, and here she makes the decision that cements exactly what kind of operative she's becoming. Reviewing flagged recordings, she notices Stepanov has changed his routine and has been meeting privately with Nikolov. She reports it. It's tempting to read Irina as simply cruel, but the show gives her more shading than that. She seems to genuinely admire Lyudmilla, unsettled by her methods yet drawn to her power in a system that rarely lets women hold any. For someone with real ambition and few paths upward, attaching herself to Lyudmilla probably feels less like villainy and more like the only viable strategy available. That doesn't make the consequences any less devastating. Lyudmilla wastes no time. Nikolov is dragged before what he believes is the chief designer, beaten and bloodied, and Nikolov breaks, revealing that the capsule is now headed for Finland. It's only afterward, shoved into the same transport van, that he discovers the real chief designer sitting there unharmed. The man he watched get tortured was a body double, staged specifically to force a confession out of him. It's a gut punch of a reveal, and it says something chilling about how far the state is willing to go, and how easily loyalty can be weaponized against the people who show it. Armed with the new coordinates, Lyudmilla doesn't hesitate. She has the descending capsule struck by a missile, forcing it down inside Soviet territory instead of across the Finnish border. The run to the border. This is where the episode earns its title outright.